The trouble started on a Tuesday, which, looking back, should have tipped me off. Nothing good ever happens on a Tuesday in our neighborhood. I just finished hanging a fresh load of laundry out on the clothesline I installed behind my garage, a quiet little patch of sun where the breeze hit just right. I'd only put it up a week ago. The dryer had finally kicked the bucket, and with energy bills climbing faster than my blood pressure, I figured, why not go old school? That's when I saw her, marching across my lawn in orthopedic sandals and a visor that looked like it hadn't left the 90s. Nadine Parlow, president of the East Haven Lakeside HOA. Full-time neighborhood tyrant. Part-time menace with a clipboard. You can't put that up, Everett, she barked, pointing at the clothesline like it had personally insulted her. It's against HOA guidelines. Clotheslines make the neighborhood look unkempt. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stared at her. It's behind my garage. No one can even see it unless they're snooping. I wasn't snooping, she snapped. I was doing my routine inspection. Funny, I said, I don't remember electing anyone to inspect my backyard. She ignored that. You'll receive a formal notice. If the line isn't down in 72 hours, you'll be fined. Sure enough, 3 days later, a letter arrived. $250 for unauthorized utility structure. I laughed out loud. Then I read it again and stopped laughing. Thing is, I'd read the HOA rules front to back when I moved in 4 years ago. That's why I'd installed the line where I did behind the garage, hidden from the street. Nothing in the bylaws said anything about that being a problem. So I called Nadine. She answered with her usual lack of charm. Everett, I hope you're calling to say you removed that eyesore. I'm calling to ask where in the bylaws it says I can't have it. There's an amendment, she said quickly. Passed last month. Funny, I said, I don't remember receiving notice of a vote. There was a pause. Well, it was an emergency amendment. Executive privilege. That's when I knew she was lying. There's no such thing in the HOA rules. My guess? She just made it up and figured nobody would challenge her. Big mistake. I started digging. Pulled up every meeting minute from the last year. No mention of any amendment. Asked around, none of the other homeowners had heard a word about it either. Nadine had pushed it through behind closed doors, probably with her little clique of clipboard-wielding cronies. That's when I got curious about something else: the address on all the HOA letters. It wasn't a P.O. box. It was a real building. A small office space on the edge of town. I drove by the next morning. There it was. A faded sign reading, East Haven Lakeside HOA Administrative Office. Looked like it used to be a dentist's office. And the best part? There was a big red for sale sign stuck in the lawn. I called the number. The realtor, a guy named Milt, was happy to talk. The HOA had been leasing the space for years. Their lease was month to month now, and the owner was looking to sell fast. Needed cash for a divorce settlement. How much? I asked. He told me. It was a lot, but not impossible. I'd been running my own landscaping business for over 20 years. I had savings. And more importantly, I had a serious bone to pick. I'll pay full price, I said. But I want it off the market today. Milt agreed. And just like that, I became the new landlord of the HOA's precious little meeting hall. They had 30 days left on the lease. And I already knew exactly what I was going to do when it expired. I waited 26 days. Not because I was patient, but because I was thorough. In that time, I made copies of every HOA document I could get my hands on: publicly available minutes, financial statements, even the outdated covenants they hadn't bothered to update in over a decade. I wasn't just going to evict them. I was going to unravel them. On the 27th day, I walked into the office with a freshly printed notice in hand and a locksmith trailing behind me. The place smelled like stale coffee and old printer toner. A single desk fan hummed in the corner, trying its best against the humidity. Nadine wasn't there yet, but two of her inner circle were: Marge, a retired tax consultant with an obsession for shrub symmetry, and Carl, who once threatened to fine a neighbor over a kid's inflatable pool. Marge looked up from a stack of envelopes. Can we help you? You actually can, I said, handing her the lease termination notice. As of midnight, I'm the new property owner. You have 48 hours to vacate. Carl scoffed. You're bluffing. The locksmith was already kneeling by the door, replacing the lock cylinder. I didn't bother responding. Nadine arrived 15 minutes later, saw the locksmith, and immediately launched into a tantrum loud enough to echo off the walls. "What do you think you're doing? You can't just waltz in and—" "It's called legal property transfer," I said. "Happens all the time. You'd know that if you ever read anything before signing." She snatched the notice from Marge, eyes darting across the page. Her jaw tightened. "You've made a very big mistake," she hissed. "Only if I wanted to keep pretending this HOA was legitimate. You can't cancel our lease like this. Actually, I can. Month to month gives me full termination rights with 48 hours notice. You'll need to find a new meeting space. You'll regret this. Maybe, but not as much as you're about to." I left them to stew while the locksmith finished up. On my way out, I passed by a stack of unopened mail. Curiosity got the better of me, so I snapped a photo of the top envelope. It was from the county auditor's office. Later that night, I cross-referenced the return address with the assessor's site. That's when things got interesting. According to county records, the HOA had filed for a tax exemption as a nonprofit, but they'd been collecting fines far beyond what was legally allowed without reporting them as income. Basically, they were operating like a business while pretending to be a volunteer organization. That's a big no-no. I compiled everything: copies of fine notices, financial discrepancies, and the exemption paperwork. Then I contacted a former client of mine, Becca, a paralegal who owed me a favor after I helped her clean up a mess of a backyard last spring. "This goes way beyond civil violation," she said, after reviewing the documents. "This is fraud. And if they've been using those fines for anything personal, it's embezzlement." "Any way to prove it?" She grinned. "Not yet, but I know how to find out." Becca filed a Freedom of Information request with the city. Took a week, but what came back was gold. The HOA had used fine revenue to pay for a retreat at a resort upstate. Receipts showed spa services, steak dinners, and even a wine tasting, all billed as community leadership development. I turned everything over to the DA's office. Meanwhile, Nadine scrambled to reestablish her empire. She tried holding meetings in her driveway, but no one showed up. She emailed residents claiming I was a hostile actor and illegally interfering with HOA operations. But the residents had grown tired of her nonsense. Once word got around that she'd used community funds for personal luxuries, support evaporated. One morning, I walked out to find my windshield covered in flyers. Each one had a poorly photoshopped image of me with devil horns and the words "neighborhood traitor" stamped across the bottom. I wasn't even mad. I just laughed and called the city code enforcement officer, who informed me Nadine had violated flyer distribution laws by littering multiple private properties. She was fined $300. Poetic. Then things got real. A week later, 2 unmarked cars pulled up in front of her house. Plainclothes detectives stepped out and knocked on her door. Neighbors gathered across lawns, whispering as Nadine was escorted out, not in cuffs but with the unmistakable slump of someone who knew the walls were closing in. The investigation revealed even more than we expected. Turns out, she'd been skimming off the top of landscaping contracts for years, taking kickbacks from a cousin who owned a landscaping company and overcharging the HOA for services never rendered. Becca's firm managed to get access to the HOA's bank statements through a subpoena. The audit showed thousands in unexplained payments. The county froze the HOA's account pending the outcome of the investigation. Without funds, they couldn't enforce fines, pay for maintenance, or even cover insurance. The rest of the board resigned within days, probably hoping to avoid being implicated. With the structure collapsed, the city stepped in and began proceedings to dissolve the HOA entirely. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I called a neighborhood meeting, an actual open forum, held in the park pavilion down the road. I brought coffee, donuts, and a stack of printed info packets outlining what had happened, what was coming next, and how we could organize a voluntary neighborhood committee with actual transparency and no power-hungry nonsense. Over 50 homeowners showed up. An elderly couple I'd never spoken to before came up afterward and thanked me. Their daughter had been fined for having a swing set for her kids. Another guy, a former Marine, said Nadine once threatened to report him for unauthorized flag placement because he flew an American flag from a pole he'd installed himself. That night, I finally let myself feel its satisfaction. Not just for what I'd done, but for what we'd stopped. This wasn't about a clothesline anymore. It was about a bully who got too comfortable thinking no one would ever push back. She was wrong. We had. And now, without her iron grip on the neighborhood, things were starting to feel normal again. People began painting their fences different colors. A guy 2 blocks over put up solar panels without getting slapped with a fine. Kids ran around with sidewalk chalk and no one called it graffiti. As for me, I added a second clothesline, just because I could. 3 weeks after the neighborhood meeting, I got a knock on my door that broke the quiet in a way I didn't expect. It was Officer Talia Rios, someone I vaguely recognized from a few community events. She had a notepad in one hand and a serious look on her face, the kind of expression that didn't usually accompany a friendly chat. "Mr. Everett Monroe?" she asked. "That's me," I said, stepping aside. "Want to come in?" She glanced behind her, then nodded. "Just for a moment. I'm here about the East Haven HOA. I led her into the kitchen. The place still smelled like cedar from the new cabinets I'd installed the week before. She didn't sit. "There's a new development," she said, flipping her notepad open. "We've had 3 formal statements from residents claiming they were threatened with foreclosure over fabricated debts." I tilted my head. "You mean the fake liens?" She nodded. "That's what we're trying to confirm. The problem is these debts were backed up with forged legal documents. County seal, judge signatures, the works. That made me stop cold. Wait, you're saying they forged court documents? That's what the district attorney's office is investigating now. We've already confirmed that at least one document filed with the county clerk's office was altered. The original version had different numbers. Someone retyped it and slipped it through the system using a clerical contact. I lowered myself onto a kitchen stool. Any clue who did it? The records show it was processed under an employee ID that belonged to Rhonda Dillard. I knew that name. Nadine's niece. She'd always been around the HOA office, supposedly as a volunteer. But I never saw her actually doing anything but stapling and sipping iced coffee. "She worked part-time in the clerk's office," I said. "Not anymore," Officer Rios replied. "She resigned 2 days before the investigation started." My mind was already moving faster than I could speak. So they were using falsified paperwork to threaten people into paying fake back dues? "Looks that way," she said. "We're building the case now. The DA plans to issue warrants, but we're moving carefully. We're trying to avoid tipping anyone off." She gave a small nod and left shortly after, leaving me sitting there with my hands flat against the countertop and a knot in my stomach. It wasn't just greed anymore. This was criminal. By the end of that week, I started hearing from neighbors who'd been too nervous to speak out before. A woman named Celeste, who lived near the pond, came by with a manila folder full of letters she'd received over the past year. Most were demands for payment, but one stood out. A notice of lien filed against her for refusing to comply with front yard aesthetic mandates. She pointed to the bottom of the page. "That's not my lot number," she said. "It's my neighbor's." The form had her name but the wrong address. And it was stamped with the same court seal Officer Rios had warned me about. I scanned it and sent it straight to Becca, who had been helping quietly from the sidelines. She called me 2 hours later with her voice low and urgent. "They went after the wrong person by accident," she said. "That document is a direct match to one filed against a different homeowner. They just changed the name and left the lot number." I could tell by her tone this wasn't just incompetence, it was a pattern. Then came the break. The local paper, the Haven Ledger, ran a front-page story titled "Neighborhood Association Under Fire for Alleged Fraud and Forgery." It named Nadine, Rhonda, and 2 other former board members who had signed off on questionable filings. A retired banker named George Lyman had come forward with notarized proof that his signature had been copied from a different document and used to approve a lien he never saw. Soon after, the county issued subpoenas. The sheriff's department showed up at Nadine's house again, this time with a search warrant. They seized 2 laptops, 1 desktop tower, and a filing cabinet. Neighbors stood on their porches watching silently as the boxes were loaded into a cruiser. I didn't see Nadine for several days after that. Her porch light stayed off. The flower pots she used to obsess over started collecting dust. But the investigation didn't stop. 3 members of the now-defunct HOA board lawyered up. One of them, Carl, tried to play the innocent card and claimed he signed everything under pressure. But his name appeared on too many documents to pretend he hadn't known what was going on. The real tipping point came when a forensic analyst found a USB drive in one of the filing cabinets. It contained spreadsheets of every fine collected over a 5-year span along with private notes about which properties were ripe for lien leverage, as the file name bluntly put it. The notes were damning. They categorized residents based on age, income, and likelihood of fighting back. Elderly homeowners were marked green. Families with language barriers were labeled yellow. Anyone with a lawyer in the family was marked red. They even had a column for compliance pressure tactics, with entries like warn about foreclosure, threaten legal costs, and mention city code violations. That's when the state attorney general's office got involved. It turned out the East Haven HOA had been part of a broader issue spreading across several communities, small, under-regulated homeowner associations exploiting legal gray areas to enforce fraudulent fines and liens. East Haven became the case study. The state announced a civil enforcement action and criminal indictments followed within a week. Charges included forgery, wire fraud, misuse of public seal, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Rhonda was arrested first. She tried to claim she was just following her aunt's instructions, but the digital trail made it impossible to distance herself. Nadine was arrested the next morning, taken from her house wearing a faded floral robe and slippers. The same neighbors she used to scold about trash days now watched as she was placed into the back of a squad car. After that, the neighborhood felt different. People started talking to each other again. I saw lawn chairs pop up in front yards where people had once kept to themselves. Someone hung a wind chime shaped like a pineapple, the unofficial symbol for hospitality. The McAllisters, who'd been fined for growing native plants instead of turf grass, planted an entire pollinator garden along their walkway. I got a letter from the city a few days later. They wanted help forming a pilot program to train residents in legal literacy around HOAs. Apparently, my little revenge purchase had become something of a local legend. Still, I didn't want to turn this into a personal crusade. I just wanted to live in a place where no one had to worry about being fined for drying laundry in the sun. I ended up donating the old HOA office space to the local library system. They turned it into a satellite location with free internet access, a printer, and a small legal resource section. The new sign out front read, East Haven Resource Annex. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. On a warm Saturday afternoon, I sat on my back porch with a lemonade in hand, watching a new neighbor put up a swing set. No one complained. No one took notes. No one handed out flyers. Just the sound of kids laughing, wind in the trees, and the crisp snap of a shirt drying on the line behind my garage. It took a while, but we'd gotten our neighborhood back. Fair, free, and finally quiet. A month passed. The neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm, less tense, more human. Kids rode bikes without parents peering nervously from porches. People started planting vegetable gardens in places that had once been subject to strict landscaping rules. The old fear of phantom violations had finally lifted. But I wasn't done. Even with the indictments and the shutdown of the HOA, there was something that still bothered me: restitution. Several neighbors had been forced to sell items, even take out loans, just to pay off fabricated fines and forged liens. The state's case focused on criminal charges, but unless someone pushed for civil damages, the victims wouldn't see a dime returned. I called Becca again. There's a path, she said after reviewing everything we had. But it's not simple. You'd need to file a class action. And the claim would have to be against the HOA as a corporate entity, even if it's defunct. What happens if the HOA no longer exists? If it was ever legally registered as a nonprofit, and they had insurance, there may be a policy still open. Plus, if they maintained a reserve fund, the court can freeze it until ownership is determined. That was the opening we needed. I spent the next 3 weeks gathering signatures from affected residents. We needed at least 20 to file jointly. We got 32. Becca drafted the complaint and submitted it with the county civil court. The suit named the former East Haven Lakeside HOA as the defendant, with Nadine Parlow, Rhonda Dillard, Carl Jensen, and Marge Halton listed as co-conspirators. 2 weeks later, a judge approved the class action status. That triggered discovery. Becca worked with a forensic accountant named Lynn, a quiet guy with wire-frame glasses and a brain for numbers that didn't quit. He dug through old bank records, scanned memory drives, and worked late pulling data from encrypted QuickBooks files the HOA had thought were deleted. What he found was worse than we'd imagined. The HOA had maintained 2 separate ledgers. One official, filed annually with the state, and a second, hidden and far more detailed, tracking an internal slush fund labeled Board Discretionary. That fund had received over $180,000 in fines, nearly half of which had never been reported. The money had been used for luxury expenses, personal home repairs, and twice in what Lynn called the boldest misuse of nonprofit funds I've ever seen, for down payments on investment properties bought under shell LLCs created by Rhonda. The ledger included exact amounts taken from each homeowner over the past 5 years. Every fraudulent lien, every manipulated fee, every dollar documented. We submitted it to the court. The judge issued a temporary freeze on all assets connected to the former board members, including personal accounts where HOA funds had been illegally transferred. A hearing date was scheduled for early spring. By then, the former board had gone completely quiet. Nadine's attorney tried to argue she had no knowledge of the false ledgers, but Lynn's forensic report included her email approving a quiet transfer of $22,000 to a contractor who never existed. Rhonda's lawyer attempted to distance her from the shell companies until county records showed she signed the incorporation documents herself. Carl and Marge didn't even bother appearing at the first hearing. The judge issued default judgments against them. At the damages hearing, Becca stood before a packed courtroom and laid out the full pattern of abuse. She read letters from residents who'd lost savings, had their credit ruined, or were forced to borrow against retirement accounts. She showed photographs of the fake notices, forged seals, and the spreadsheet that ranked homeowners by how easily they could be exploited. The judge didn't hold back. In his ruling, he stated the HOA had operated as a tool of financial coercion under the guise of community management, and that the board had engaged in an extended pattern of deliberate fraud, document falsification, and financial exploitation. He awarded full restitution, $180,000 to be returned to affected residents. But he went further. He ordered the seizure of all assets connected to the shell LLCs, including the 2 rental properties Rhonda had purchased. Those would be sold at auction, with proceeds added to the restitution fund. He also referred the case to the state bar to investigate Nadine's attorney for potential misconduct regarding improperly filed documents and conflicts of interest. After the ruling, the courtroom emptied slowly. Some people hugged. Others just sat quietly, absorbing the fact that it was finally over. One man, an older Navy vet named Hank, came up and shook my hand. His voice cracked when he said his wife had passed last year, still thinking they owed the HOA money they never did. That night was the first time in months I slept through without waking up once. 2 weeks later, restitution checks started arriving. People posted photos of them on the neighborhood message board, not to brag, but to celebrate. One woman used hers to fix the roof she'd been told was visually disruptive. Someone else bought a new wheelchair ramp for his mother. Another donated hers to the local community garden. The neighborhood was changing again, but this time by choice. I decided to step back quietly. I still had my landscaping business to run, and honestly, I missed the smell of fresh cut grass and the satisfaction of a well-shaped hedge. I handed control of the new volunteer resident council to a woman named Teresa, a retired school principal who had a knack for organizing people without stepping on anyone's toes. Before I left the meeting, she turned to me and said, "You know, Everett, I hadn't spoken to half my neighbors in years before this all happened. Now I've had coffee with 14 of them." I smiled and nodded. Funny what happens when people stop being afraid of their own yards. On my walk back home, I passed by the old HOA office, now officially the East Haven Resource Annex. The library had added a mural to the sidewall painted by local students. It showed a row of houses with different colors and styles, all connected by a winding garden path. Right in the center stood a clothesline, flapping with shirts of every shade. I stood there for a long time, watching the breeze move through the painted fabric. It hadn't started as some grand plan. It was just a clothesline, a way to save a few bucks and dry shirts in the sun. But that small act, ordinary, practical, stubborn, had been enough to expose the rot hiding behind clipboards and fine print. I headed home, poured a glass of iced tea, and settled into my porch chair. No more inspection notices. No more threats. Just the creak of the rocker, the hum of summer, and the quiet knowledge that we'd taken our neighborhood back, not with anger, but with truth, patience, and a little bit of rope.